Everyone thought the mountain man would pick a beauty, but his heart belonged to the obese girl. The autumn of 1819 settled over the Rocky Mountains like frost on morning grass. The small town of Silvercrest, nestled deep within the peaks, was preparing for its most significant celebration of the year, the Harvest Festival, the one night when eligible men would publicly claim their intended brides before the entire community. Thomas Hale stood at the edge of his cabin, watching smoke rise from chimneys across the valley below. At 34 years old, he was a legend among the mountain towns. Broad-shouldered, with piercing blue eyes and weathered skin that spoke of countless winters survived in solitude, Thomas embodied everything the frontier demanded of its men: strength, resilience, and an unyielding moral compass. He had saved the town from mountain lions, guided lost travelers through blizzards, and refused more than one lucrative trapping route because he deemed it too destructive to the land. Yet for all his accomplishments, there was one mystery that gnawed at the townspeople's curiosity. Why had Thomas remained unmarried? The eligible women of Silvercrest had made their intentions abundantly clear. Evelyn Hartwell, the banker's daughter, possessed striking features and an education from the East. Clara Mitchell, the blacksmith's daughter, was known for her spirited nature and her ability to manage a household with precision. Ruth Pemberton came from the wealthiest family in 3 counties, and her beauty was undeniable: golden hair, emerald eyes, and a figure that turned heads wherever she walked. These 3 women, collectively known as the Valley's finest, had become the subject of every conversation in town. Merchants wagered on which of them Thomas would choose. Older women gossiped over their mending, convinced they could predict his preference. Even the preacher mentioned somewhat awkwardly that it was time for their mountain man to settle down and produce heirs. Thomas was aware of none of this, or rather, he was aware but chose to ignore it. He had other concerns that kept him awake at night, wrestling with thoughts that seemed to have no resolution. The truth was, Thomas had seen something in a moment of vulnerability that had altered everything. It had been 18 months earlier, in the brutal winter of 1818. Thomas had been caught in one of the worst storms of his life, a blizzard so fierce that even experienced trappers spoke of it in hushed tones. A bear trap, set improperly in his haste to escape the weather, had caught his left leg just below the knee. The pain had been extraordinary, and the cold had threatened to stop his heart. He remembered dragging himself toward a structure, a small storage shed on the edge of town that he'd built years ago. He remembered collapsing, certain that death was claiming him, and then, impossibly, warmth. A voice, gentle hands working with practiced care. Anna Brooks. She'd been gathering firewood for the church when she'd spotted him, nearly frozen in the snow. Anna, the overlooked daughter of the town's maid, had carried him into the warmth of that shed, a feat that should have been impossible for someone of her size, yet her determination had made it possible. For 8 days she had come to him, bringing broth, changing bandages, speaking in low, steady tones about everyday things: the rabbits she'd seen, the way the light fell on the ice, how she'd taught the Miller boy his letters. She had never expressed pity. She had never suggested he was a burden. She had simply cared, with the kind of care that asks nothing in return. When Thomas had finally recovered enough to return to town, he'd asked Anna about her actions. She'd blushed deeply, her round face flushing pink, and said only, "You were hurt. I couldn't leave you alone." Since that moment, Thomas had been unable to think of anyone else. The problem was, Anna Brooks was invisible to Silvercrest. She was the maid's daughter, a quiet, generous soul who spent her days helping anyone who needed her. She taught reading to illiterate adults, cared for the sick, minded orphan children, and asked for nothing in return. She was never the prettiest woman in a room. In fact, because of her full-figured form, some of the crueler townsfolk called her the heavy girl, or made jokes about her lack of suitors. Thomas had watched people hurt her with casual cruelty, and it had kindled a quiet rage in his heart. The night before the festival, Thomas sat in his cabin, staring into the fire. He had made a decision, one that would shake the foundations of every expectation the town held. He would choose Anna. But even as he resolved this, doubt crept in like fog. He was a practical man, and there were practical concerns. Anna would face relentless ridicule. The very women who competed for him would turn cruel, their envy transforming into mockery. The townspeople would question his judgment. Some would suggest he'd lost his mind, or that he was making some kind of misguided charitable gesture. And Anna herself, would she even want him? She was kind to everyone. Perhaps she felt only gratitude for the brief moments they'd shared. Perhaps she would be mortified to be put on display. Her private act of mercy suddenly made public and analyzed by every jealous woman in town. Thomas stood and paced the small cabin, his large frame seeming to fill every corner. He thought of the way Anna's eyes had looked at him that winter, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet understanding. He thought of how her hands had moved with such careful precision, how her voice had never wavered, even when changing his bandages must have been painful for her. He thought of a life lived watching everyone else be happy while he waited for some abstract notion of perfection. By dawn, he'd resolved, whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, he would offer Anna the choice to dance with him at the festival. The rest would be up to fate. The hall was decorated with autumn leaves, dried corn husks, and candles that cast flickering light across every surface. A small orchestra, violin, cello, and piano, sat on the stage tuning their instruments. The townspeople filed in, dressed in their finest clothing. The women wore silk dresses in jewel tones, their hair braided with ribbons and adorned with fresh flowers. The men wore their best jackets and polished boots. Evelyn Hartwell stood near the refreshment table, her pale yellow dress making her look like a shaft of autumn sunlight. She had positioned herself where Thomas would have to see her, and she smiled confidently at every man who passed. Clara Mitchell sat with her family, her dark blue dress and careful posture, speaking of a woman ready for marriage and all its responsibilities. She nodded politely to those who greeted her, her demeanor one of assured expectation. Ruth Pemberton, however, was the true focal point of the evening. Her emerald gown was imported, everyone knew it, and her golden hair had been styled into an elaborate arrangement of curls. She sat slightly elevated, surrounded by other women who seemed to be orbiting her brilliance. In the corner, away from the main gathering, Anna Brooks sat on a simple wooden chair. Her dress was modest, pale blue, practical, well-made, but clearly not expensive. Her light brown hair was braided simply down her back, with no flowers or ribbons. She held herself carefully, trying to take up as little space as possible, though her full figure made invisibility impossible. Her friend Margaret sat beside her, squeezing her hand occasionally. "Don't let them bother you," Margaret whispered. "You're twice as kind as all three of them combined." Anna merely smiled sadly. "Kindness doesn't dance at festivals, Margaret. Kindness sits in corners." The mayor began the ceremony, calling out the names of eligible men one by one. Each man would stand, be publicly acknowledged, and then move to claim a dancing partner, though most had already arranged such things privately, and the public ritual was more tradition than surprise. When Thomas Hale's name was called, the crowd fell silent. All conversation ceased. Even the orchestra seemed to pause, the musicians looking up from their instruments. Thomas rose from where he'd been standing at the back of the hall. He wore a jacket of dark leather, his broad shoulders filling it perfectly. His blue eyes swept across the crowd, and hundreds of hearts seemed to stop. He descended toward the three women who were watching him with barely concealed anticipation, and then he walked past them. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Evelyn's confident smile faltered. Clara's careful posture stiffened. Ruth's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. Thomas continued walking toward the corner, his pace steady and sure. The crowd parted before him like water before a bow. Anna looked up, confused, as if perhaps he was walking past her too, heading for someone else entirely. But Thomas stopped directly in front of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Anna's round face had gone pale, her brown eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope mixed with fear. "Anna Brooks," Thomas said, his voice carrying through the silent hall. "Would you dance with me?" The question seemed to hang in the air, suspended between expectation and reality. Anna's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Her hands trembled in her lap. She began, her voice barely audible. Thomas extended his hand. "I know this might seem strange to you, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Every eye in the hall was fixed on them. Whispers had begun, angry whispers, confused whispers, curious whispers. Anna took his hand. The moment her fingers touched his palm, it was as if the hall exhaled collectively. Thomas helped her to her feet with surprising gentleness, and together they walked to the center of the dancing floor. The orchestra, taking their cue, began to play a waltz. It was a melody that spoke of longing and grace, and as Thomas placed his hand on Anna's waist, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. They were not the most graceful dancers. Anna was nervous, and Thomas was concentrating on making sure she felt safe. But what they lacked in technical precision, they made up for in something far more powerful: genuine connection. Each movement spoke of care. Each step was an affirmation. When the music ended, there was a moment of complete silence. Then, gradually, applause began. Hesitant at first, then growing stronger. Some people clapped reluctantly, stunned by what they'd witnessed. Others clapped with genuine enthusiasm, having suddenly understood something they'd missed before. One person did not clap. Ruth Pemberton rose from her seat and walked directly out of the hall, her emerald dress seeming to flow with her anger. Her family, mortified, quickly followed. After the festival, Thomas requested a meeting with the town council and the three families of the valley's finest. It was an unprecedented move, and the entire town buzzed with speculation about what he would say. The hall was packed when Thomas stood before them, Anna beside him, no longer hidden, but standing proud at his side. "I need to explain myself," Thomas began, his voice steady, "because I know I've disappointed many of you, and perhaps confused most of you. But I believe in honoring the truth, and the truth is important here." He turned to address the families directly. 18 months ago, I was caught in a blizzard with a bear trap wound. I was bleeding, freezing, and certain I would die. I was found by Anna Brooks, who could have easily ignored me. I was not her responsibility in helping me put her in danger. Instead, she brought me to shelter, cared for me without complaint for 8 days, and asked for nothing in return. Thomas paused, his eyes moving across the faces watching him. "I've spent my life learning what matters. I've spent winters alone in the mountains, and I've learned that survival is not about strength or intelligence alone. It's about character. It's about how you treat people when no one is watching. It's about what you choose to do when kindness costs you something." He turned to look at Evelyn, Clara, and Ruth. "You are all beautiful women, and I mean no disrespect to your families. But beauty is like snow in the mountains. It melts. Character, however, is like the stone beneath the snow. It endures." Then his gaze found Anna's face, and something in his expression softened entirely. "Anna Brooks is the strongest person I know. Not physically, though she is stronger than she believes. She is strong in her choices, in her commitments, and in her heart. When I looked around that festival and saw her sitting in the corner, trying to disappear, I saw a woman who had spent her life being invisible, despite giving everything to those around her. I saw someone worth choosing." Thomas took Anna's hand. "And I'm asking this community to see her as I do." But the story did not end with applause and acceptance, because life in the frontier was rarely that simple. 2 weeks after the festival, Anna came to Thomas's cabin in the evening, tears streaming down her face. I need to tell you something, she said, collapsing into a chair. Something I should have told you before the festival, something that might change everything. Thomas knelt beside her, his large hands carefully wiping away her tears. Tell me, he said simply. 3 years ago, Anna began, her voice breaking. I was in love. There was a man, Jacob Prescott, who worked as a trader. He was kind to me, and I thought he cared for me as I cared for him. We made promises to each other in secret. Thomas felt something twist in his chest, but he remained silent, letting her continue. He left without a word. I later learned he had gone east to marry a wealthy woman from Boston. The reason was financial. Her father had offered him a trading partnership worth thousands of dollars. He chose money over his promises to me. Anna's hands were shaking. What I'm trying to say is, I'm afraid. I'm afraid that you've chosen me out of a sense of obligation, or because you pity me. I'm afraid that one day you'll resent me because I'm not Evelyn or Clara or Ruth. I'm afraid that when the novelty fades, you'll realize you made a terrible mistake. The vulnerability in her voice was heartbreaking. Thomas reached up and took her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. Anna, listen to me. I chose you not despite who you are, but because of who you are. I have no illusions about how this will be. The town will continue to question us. Some will be cruel. There will be difficult days. But I am not Jacob Prescott. I do not leave people who matter to me. I do not choose money over promises, and I most certainly will never regret choosing you. But what if, Anna began. No, Thomas interrupted gently. No more what-ifs. I cannot promise you a life without hardship. I cannot promise you that everyone will accept us. But I can promise you this. I will be honest with you always. I will work hard for us. And I will love you, not because you're invisible or because I feel sorry for you, but because you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met. He kissed her forehead. Now, we're going to do something that might frighten you, but I need you to trust me. The next morning, Thomas and Anna walked together to the town square. It was early before most people were awake, but word spread quickly. By the time they reached the center of town, people were emerging from their homes and businesses, curious about what the mountain man and the maid's daughter were doing, walking through Silvercrest together at dawn. Thomas, with Anna beside him, went directly to Ruth Pemberton's house. He knocked on the door, and Ruth herself answered, clearly shocked to find him on her doorstep, and even more shocked to find him accompanied by Anna. Mr. Hale, Ruth said, her tone cold, I'm surprised you have the audacity to show your face here. I've come to apologize, Thomas said, but not for the reasons you think. He gestured for Ruth to step outside, and she did so reluctantly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. I'm sorry, Thomas continued, for making a public spectacle that wounded your pride. You didn't deserve that, but I'm not sorry for my choice, and I need you to understand why. He turned to face Ruth directly, his voice firm but not unkind. You are a lovely woman, Ruth. You have every advantage in this world. You've been told you're beautiful since you were a child. People move aside for you. People want you, and that's never your fault. It's simply how the world is. But I've learned that in a frontier life, beauty fades, and if there's nothing beneath it, you're left with nothing. Ruth's face had flushed red. Anna, Thomas continued, gesturing to the woman beside him, has spent her life being invisible. She's been mocked for her appearance. She's been taken for granted. And yet she wakes every morning and chooses to be kind. That is a kind of strength you can't understand unless you've been invisible. Anna reached out and actually touched Ruth's arm gently. I don't hate you, Anna said softly. I've never hated you. But I've watched you, and I think perhaps you're lonely despite having everything. I think you're surrounded by people who want what you have rather than who you are. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Ruth's face crumpled, and to everyone's surprise, including her own, she began to cry. "I am lonely," she whispered. "I've always been lonely." And in that moment, something shifted in the town's understanding. They began to see not the beautiful woman who'd been rejected by the most eligible man in 3 counties, but a frightened girl who had been valued for her appearance her entire life, and nothing else. Thomas and Anna were married in the spring of 1820, a quiet ceremony at the church with the entire town in attendance. The mayor performed the service, and even the priest seemed moved by the genuine love evident between them. Thomas had been true to his word. He'd built a small cabin on a hill overlooking the valley, not grand but solid and well-crafted. He'd planted wildflowers around the perimeter, lupin, blanket flower, and Indian paintbrush. Anna's favorite flowers, which she'd mentioned only in passing one evening. The first winter in their home, Anna became pregnant. The pregnancy was difficult. The mountain winters were harsh, and Anna's body struggled. Thomas stayed close, building fires, preparing meals, and reading to her from the few books they possessed. There were nights when he held her through fever, certain he would lose her, terrified in a way he'd never been before. But Anna was stronger than anyone realized. In March, as spring began to tentatively arrive, she gave birth to a daughter. The baby was perfectly formed, with her mother's brown eyes and her father's strong features. They named her Eleanor. By 1825, Silvercrest had transformed in subtle but important ways. Eleanor Hale was 5 years old, running through the town with the confidence of a child who had never been made to feel ashamed of herself. She was her father's shadow, following him on his trapline, learning to read the forest. She was her mother's joy, helping Anna care for the sick and the orphaned. The valley's finest had scattered. Ruth had eventually married a young man from California who appreciated her not for her beauty, but for her intelligence. It turned out she was remarkably clever, and she'd been hiding it beneath layers of beauty her entire life. Evelyn had married a merchant from Philadelphia and moved east. Clara remained in Silvercrest, running her family's blacksmith business and becoming an unexpected ally to Anna. The Harvest Festival that year was different. It was no longer primarily about men choosing women. Instead, the entire town gathered to celebrate the season's abundance, and unmarried people of all kinds came to dance and socialize with far less pressure. When Thomas and Anna danced to the opening waltz, just as they had 5 years earlier, no one was shocked anymore. Instead, people smiled at the sight of them. Their love was no longer strange or surprising. It had become something the town took for granted, woven into the fabric of their community. Eleanor danced with her father while Anna clapped and laughed, her full face glowing with joy. On a cool autumn evening in 1826, Thomas sat on the porch of their cabin, Eleanor asleep in his arms, while Anna worked on mending by candlelight. "Do you ever regret it?" Anna asked suddenly. "Choosing me that night at the festival? Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you'd chosen differently?" Thomas looked at his wife. Her face was no longer young. There were faint lines around her eyes from squinting in the mountain sun. Her hair had a few threads of gray. She was more beautiful to him in this moment than she had been on the day of the festival. "Not for a single moment," he said. Anna set down her mending and came to sit beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the evening sounds. Crickets, the distant call of a nightjar, the wind moving through the pines. I was thinking," Anna said quietly, "about that girl in the corner at the festival, the one who was trying to disappear. I want to make sure Eleanor never feels that way. I want her to know that she is valuable, not because she's beautiful or accomplished, but simply because she exists." "She will," Thomas assured her, "because you'll teach her, and because she'll see every single day how you live your life. She'll watch you tend to sick people who can't repay you. She'll watch you teach children to read. She'll watch you love her father, not because he's strong or impressive, but because he's good." Eleanor stirred in his arms, and Thomas carefully carried her inside, laying her in her small bed and pulling a quilt over her. He returned to the porch where Anna was waiting. They stood together, looking out over the valley. Lights twinkled in the distant town of Silvercrest. Somewhere out there, people were living their lives, making their choices, learning what mattered and what did not. "Thank you," Anna whispered. "For what?" Thomas asked. "For seeing me, for choosing me, for being brave enough to love someone the world wanted to ignore." Thomas took her hand and brought it to his lips. "Anna, my beloved, the world's opinion was never what mattered. What matters is this. On a cold winter's night, a woman chose to save a stranger's life, and that same woman spends every day of her life choosing to make the world better. How could I not choose her? How could any man with sense not choose her?" Anna turned to face him, and in the moonlight, her face was radiant. "We did it, didn't we? We proved them all wrong. The townspeople who said I'd never marry, the cynics who believed you'd only wanted to make some grand gesture. We built something real." "We did more than that," Thomas said. "We showed them all what love actually means. Not the kind of love that's about beauty or status or wealth, the kind of love that persists through hardship, that chooses the other person's well-being above all else, that is quiet and steady and true." He pulled her close, and they danced together on the porch of their small cabin, to no music, but the symphony of the mountains and the deep, abiding silence that comes from complete contentment. Eleanor, had she been awake to see it, would have watched her parents move together in perfect harmony, each supporting the other, each making the other whole. And she would have learned in that moment that true beauty is found not in appearance, but in the way a person looks at someone they love with complete acceptance and unwavering devotion. The mountain man, who everyone thought would choose a beauty, had instead chosen something far more precious, a woman with a heart so genuine, so generous, and so strong that she transformed everyone around her simply by being herself. And that woman, who the world had tried to make invisible, had instead become a light that shone across the entire valley, proof that what society deems unworthy is often exactly what has the most worth. Their story spread through the mountain towns, passed down through generations. Parents told it to children. It became a reminder that the truest love is often hidden in the places society teaches us not to look.